Hello everyone, my name is Cannell Games, and today we're going to be talking about Star Wars Battlefront. Released on November 17th, 2015, the reboot of the Star Wars Battlefront franchise has been available for a little over a year, and all 4 DLC expansion packs purchased through the Season Pass have now been made available. Heavily anticipated from the start, the game was met with significant criticism and disappointment from its fanbase, currently holding a 3.5 user score on Metacritic. Professional critic reviews are rather lukewarm, though limited to the original release, and they give Star Wars Battlefront an aggregate score of 72, with 11 mixed reviews and 8 positive reviews. Now, a little bit of a disconnect between critics and fans is far from unique to Star Wars Battlefront, but a fair share of the criticism is not without merit. That being said, Star Wars Battlefront is not entirely terrible, nor is it one of the greatest games in recent memory, certainly within the Star Wars universe. However, with its sequel due for release at some point in 2017, I just want to take a retrospective look at the complete game now that all the DLC has been made available for a little while, and give Star Wars Battlefront a final verdict. So to be clear, this isn't going to be a review where I give a final score at the end, but rather just a discussion about the features and elements in the game, and where I think they succeed, or where I think they are a little lackluster. And just a quick note, you'll notice I'm fairly underleveled or limited in my equipment and the gameplay you're watching, but I did originally purchase Battlefront on Xbox One because my PC was a little ill-equipped for the task, but over the holidays the complete package of Battlefront became available on PC for about $30, and I kinda wanted to see what the game could look like on my upgraded PC. So without any further ado, let's get started. The first aspect of the title that I want to talk about is whether it feels like Star Wars, and whether it's the soundtrack, the sprawling landscapes of very recognizable planets and environments, or just the sounds of blaster fire and lightsabers cutting down soldiers, the game does feel like Star Wars, at least on the surface. The aesthetic and atmosphere is incredibly well captured, and something that DICE has been really successful with, and that has continued with their newest release in the Battlefield franchise, is the utilization of the soundtrack during the most tense moments of battle to really immerse the player in the game, such as when a final point is being contested, or a last push is being made to stop the advance of AT-ATs. The sound really puts you into the Star Wars universe, and I think this is one of the best features of the title that has been present since its original release in 2015. The feeling of it being Star Wars extends to the inclusion of several iconic heroes, villains, and other characters, but I'll talk a little bit more about the extremely powerful heroes a little later on and some of the problems that I think they have. The last thing that I want to talk about in relation to the game's feeling like Star Wars are the space battles. The last 2 expansions, Death Star and Scarif, have really improved what I felt was really lacking in the initial release of the game. Essentially, there were no space battles at all, but rather just pitched battles in the atmosphere above other maps that you could already experience on the ground. Now, I don't remember too many of Star Wars' iconic space battles taking place a few thousand feet above the sands of Tatooine, so this was a little disappointing. Luckily, the DLC does address this, and it again feels a lot more like Star Wars as a result. The visuals are on point, the sound effects are there, and the actual gameplay mechanics of space battles aren't all that bad. Maneuvering and twisting through space, trying to lock onto an enemy fighter, feels a lot like a fast-paced dogfight from the Star Wars films, at least for me. However, I did find the controls really frustrating on PC with a keyboard and mouse, and I actually switched between keyboard and mouse while on the ground, and using a controller while in an air vehicle. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the actual gameplay itself, aside from the space battles. The one thing regarding gameplay that I think could be significantly improved upon is the utilization of heroes, particularly our Jedi and Sith heroes. Ranged heroes such as Boba Fett and newly added Rogue One character Orson Krennic work just fine, albeit a little overpowered like all the heroes, but they function in a similar way to another soldier, just with a lot more firepower behind their weapon and special abilities. The Force-sensitive heroes, in my opinion, just aren't as engaging to play. They are powerful, without a doubt, and some of their abilities, such as Vader's Force Choke, do really feel awesome to execute in-game. But overall, I don't find wielding a lightsaber in this game to be all that fun. You're deadly with an array of cool abilities, but at the end of the day, I don't really feel like a Jedi. And though I'm not sure how this could be improved, it is one of the rare moments in this game where it doesn't feel like a true Star Wars experience. Additionally, with the vast majority of game modes being objective-based, there's still no intuitive way to work as a team. Although other games made by DICE, such as the Battlefield games, have never really put teamwork front and center, there was still some way to communicate with your teammates, or at the very least work together in a smaller squad, such as Battlefield 1. Instead, Battlefront still relies upon using a single partner as a mobile spawn point, and nonsensically rushing towards whatever objective you are tasked with attacking or defending, and hopefully the rest of your team has the same idea. There is the team chat in-game, but that is very rarely used for anything. Another area of the game that has remained underdeveloped is the use of vehicles. Aside from special vehicles such as the U-Wing and Red 5, there have been no standard additions beyond the standard fighters and interceptors included in the base game, with the Rebels having no real equivalent to the AT-ST. B-Wings and TIE Bombers have been added to the game, but not as pilotable alternatives, just an AI-controlled power-up that can be periodically activated as a pickup in one of the various space battle maps. I can't think of too many vehicles that are blatantly absent from the game, but I'm sure something could have been inserted. The numerous weapons added to the game certainly weren't iconic pieces of the Star Wars universe, and they were able to expand that arsenal. And keeping the game balanced certainly isn't the reason for a lack of vehicle additions, given the lack of balance in the game in its present state. From overpowered heroes to a plethora of instant kill cheese abilities and weapons, a competitive state of game balance has certainly taken a backseat to the attempts to foster a fun and casual Star Wars gaming experience. In terms of the regular shooter-based gameplay, nothing has changed at all since the original release. The core game is still the same, so if you didn't find that all that engaging in 2015, you probably won't find there's been any change for you now. Aside from a number of new weapons, special abilities, and heroes, there's nothing to really change how the game is played. Now, I'm not going to say the gameplay is incredibly engaging or memorable, but in this game's defense, has anyone recently taken a look at the first two Battlefront titles? The gameplay wasn't all that engaging then either. Over-the-shoulder, third-person shooter, and the guns didn't have much recoil or skill required in aiming. Moving your character was really clunky, and there were other problems as well. Now, does that mean that the reboot of the franchise shouldn't have been better and improved in these aspects? Absolutely it should have, but for people to focus on the gameplay, which several reviews on Metacritic specifically identified as being the main problem, they may need to go back and look at the origins of this franchise. Now, just to reiterate, are the mechanics deep and engaging? No, not really. But that was never the draw of the previous Battlefront titles, at least in my opinion. The draw of Battlefront was always number 1, Star Wars, and number 2, the inclusion of in-depth and engaging game modes. Galactic Conquest being the main draw. Once again, that was just for me, but I'm sure a lot of people share that opinion. If you were expecting some groundbreaking competitive multiplayer title, you may have missed that Battlefront was the franchise tag associated with this game. But let's shift our focus to the lack of game modes, because that's where the game really falters. Seeing as Galactic Conquest is still absent from the title, it's been a huge disappointment to players. Each DLC expansion pack did bring a new game mode, but they didn't deviate all that much from other game modes. Really, they were just map-specific modes that utilized similar mechanics from others. Extract a shipment of resources, extract R2-D2 from the Death Star, get the Death Star plans from point A to point B. What I do like about these modes is that they all try to establish a little bit of narrative quality to a multiplayer game that is completely devoid of narrative and storytelling. Additionally, it provides some context and purpose for these battles, instead of capture the point because reasons, which we see in a lot of other games. However, that doesn't excuse this game for being rather lackluster in terms of variety and choice for the player. The best addition with the DLC is Battle Station, which is a multi-phased mode, similar to operations from Battlefield 1. The first phase takes place in space, before you board an Imperial ship, and then need to extract R2-D2 with the plans to the Death Star. You then replicate the final scene from A New Hope, as the rebels need to fly through the trenches of the Death Star to destroy the station. The mode is fun and adds something fresh to the rather bland single-instance game modes, and it is the closest this game gets to something like Galactic Conquest. But unfortunately, that's the closest this game gets to Galactic Conquest, which is still pretty far. The final expansion basically adds the exact same stuff, except within the confines of the Rogue One plotline. You fight in space to get through the planetary shield on Scarif, then you blow up an objective and extract the Death Star data. These modes have been the most enjoyable for me, but the actual map construction in the Rogue One Scarif DLC has some mysterious bushes where you can walk through some, shoot through some, but not all of them, and I think it's rather poorly executed. All in all, in terms of content, the game is still rather light in that regard, and there is the illusion of choice in the game modes, but a small player base on PC has left some game modes a little underpopulated, particularly off-peak hours. This is exacerbated by the decision, which has become increasingly common with developers, to split player bases along DLC packages. Quality, complete titles don't necessarily require expansions and DLC, but they are a welcome addition to an already complete game. A popular example would be Diablo 2's Lord of Destruction expansion pack or StarCraft's Brood War. Now, holding up older Blizzard titles as the gold standard of content may seem unfair, but it would be nice if more titles received similar treatment. The largest, and in my opinion most valid criticism of this game at release was the lack of content included in the base game of Star Wars Battlefront. Particularly with a price tag of $60 attached to it, it seemed a little high for it was rather a thin and incomplete experience. Furthermore, gamers who wanted the Season Pass included forked out over $100 for this game. Now, on the surface, a complete game with 4 expansion packs sounds like pretty good value. And that would be true, except that, in my opinion, only now does Star Wars Battlefront even begin to approach a full game, and yet it still lacks content in some areas. Obviously, it's about money and business, but for consumers paying over $100 for something that is woefully lacking in content, that is something that could kill a franchise. Luckily, I suppose, for EA and DICE, this franchise happens to be Star Wars, and people are going to be buying the sequel regardless of how badly they were burned this time around. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the lack of a true single-player experience. This has not been expanded upon at all with the DLC packages, and the single player is still something that I haven't even touched since I initially purchased the game in 2015. The lack of a single player campaign or story is frustrating, but I think I can explain its absence. The final expansion to Battlefront was based around the newest Star Wars film Rogue One, and in that we see the problem that faced DICE in any attempt to create a single player campaign or especially a story mode. With the complete destruction of the Star Wars expanded universe, it was made clear that Disney and the Star Wars movie franchise would have complete control over the Star Wars story. The Old Republic story seems to still be intact, but that's probably because it's so far removed from the current Star Wars mythos, but it doesn't seem likely that DICE and EA would have been given the go-ahead to craft any story that added information to the Star Wars universe as Disney is trying to deal with it. And that would be because it would possibly take away plot lines and stories that could be told through the movie franchise. Even retelling old stories or filling in the gaps is likely a no-no because Rogue One was filling in the gaps as well, and an upcoming Han Solo film will fill in further gaps into the Star Wars saga. Does this suddenly make Star Wars Battlefront good and excusable for not including a single-player campaign? No, but it should at least shed some light on why there was no single-player campaign of any real substance. We can still criticize those decisions. Now, the most obvious way to fix this, however, would have been the inclusion of Galactic Conquest, and with the legacy that the first two Battlefront titles left, the exclusion of this game mode is beyond confusing and quite simply inexcusable. All in all, Star Wars Battlefront is still a decent game, and much like its predecessors, the gameplay isn't overly memorable, but the Star Wars aesthetic is powerful and immersive. The DLC doesn't fix the majority of its original problems, but does add a fair amount of content to keep the game fresh for fans of Star Wars, but it also fails to replicate the quality and replay value of the original two Battlefront games. With the sequel likely emerging sometime this year, I can't really say I'm all that optimistic. I'm sure the game will look polished and be aesthetically pleasing, but I'm not sure what significant changes they'll be able to make it a memorable video game. I don't foresee any single-player campaign with any substance given my thoughts about Disney's control of the franchise, and I think there's very little DICE will decide to add beyond more weapons and maps, with the bulk of the content likely hidden behind a series of DLC paywalls. My hope would be for, obviously, the inclusion of Galactic Conquest, but a more expansive version of Battlefield 1's operations mode could also prove interesting and possibly more likely. Or, we could also see a more dynamic multiplayer experience similar to PlanetSide, or the short-lived PS3 title Meg that included some of the elements of Galactic Conquest, but on a server-wide multiplayer scale. But that's just my opinion. Let me know yours in the comments section below. My name is Cannell Games, and I'll speak to you next time.